The views and opinions expressed on the Nova Society are those of the panelists and guests and do not necessarily reflect the views or opinions of the Phoenix Research Institute or any institution which any panel member is associated. Reproduction or dissemination other than for the purpose of education or information without the express written permission of the Phoenix Research Institute or Nova Society Media is strictly prohibited.
I'd like to welcome everyone back to the Nova Society. I'm Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, and I'm here with my guests, Dr. Priscilla Hobbs, Dr. Scott Gershwer, and Dr. Mark Bound. Today, our panel will once again be answering questions from our listeners. Today's question is from Lonnie, who lives in Seattle, Washington. And Lonnie asks, I know the panel doesn't like to put too much emphasis on polling data. Yet there are some interesting trends happening since the entry of Vice President Harris. Polls show that Harris leads overall in the general election and has taken a statistical lead in many of the swing states. The rating is double digits ahead of Trump. Yet she didn't get the post-convention bump that candidates usually see. How much faith can we put into these trends? Is this a reality? Why didn't Harris get the usual post-convention bump other candidates normally see? Priscilla, let's begin with you, if I may.
I know this is, we haven't talked my opinion of Harris in a while, if ever, but quite frankly, I'm not entirely convinced that she's the right pick for the Democratic Party. And so if we're seeing that reflected in poll numbers, I think it's because other people probably feel the same way that I feel about not really being too confident or too certain about her being the president. And it's not because she is a woman. It's more that she kind of represents the establishment that a number of us younger voters were really hoping to see some change happening in. We had the same feelings when she was made vice president. So it's certainly not about her ability to do the role. She's probably one of the most qualified politicians, and that's certainly not questioning that. But I think whether or not she has the oomph that the Democratic Party really needs right now, if she really is going to be the change agent that our country needs, that part I don't quite know. I think we're in untested waters there. I'm now on the record for ever saying how I feel about Kamala Harris. I suppose I could say more, but I really don't have much else to add to it. I do think from the perspective of polling numbers, if we're not seeing the numbers the way we would typically see, I also think poll numbers are usually in a realm of confirmation bias. So it depends on who's doing the polling and whether or not they're asking the right questions of the people who would actually generate the poll data. Quite honestly, I don't know that a lot of people really want to engage in polls right now.
Yeah, well, definitely the quantitative analysis has been under fire for quite a while now because of the various factors that go into making a successful poll are difficult, always have been, but even more difficult now that people are not necessarily picking up their phones and that people are not necessarily engaging with polls, or if they do, sometimes people have a heightened sense of self-awareness about it and say things that aren't necessarily true to make themselves look better than they really are, and a whole bunch of other factors like that. There's so many factors that go into a successful poll. It's very, very difficult, and there's tons of polls out there, and most of them are probably really poorly done. But I will say this, I mean, it's interesting to have Priscilla's perspective on this because she's younger than the rest of us, and because she does represent, Priscilla, you do represent a different sort of demographic. Mark and I spent a lot of time a year ago or so trying to find another vice presidential candidate other than Kamala Harris. We probably did this over 2 or 3 different podcasts, trying to find who would be a good substitute, because our belief at that time was, should Joe Biden be reelected? Should he not be able to finish out the second term? Who would be the person that Americans could get behind and rally around, which would make his run for the presidency more palatable? And the fact is, we really couldn't find anybody. There are a number of different reasons for that. Demographics, name recognition, which she doesn't actually seem to have as much of as people might think. And the fact that she is a woman of color, yes, an Asian woman, all that kind of stuff, which she's been downplaying, and I think rightfully so, because it's obvious. But she is also the victim of misogyny on the part of a lot of right wingers, which is including people I know who say the most disgusting things. And there are memes out there and all kinds of stuff. They just can't seem to accept that somebody is what they really do appear to be, which was true of Obama as well and is even more bizarre in the case of Kamala Harris. The other thing I'll say about it as far as the post-convention bump is that she got a really good pre-convention bump, and there was another week when she announced Tim Walz as her running mate that there was a big bump. And I'm not sure how much you can really bump in America. We're a 45-10 country, and we're fighting for that 10% of the vote to join us and elect a president that we like. We're all doing that if we're in those 45% twins there. So I think polls are flawed, difficult, more difficult than people understand. And there's got to be the sense of disgust that we feel for Donald Trump as the main motivation for electing Kamala Harris as our next president.
And you're right. Having Priscilla's perspective as somebody from a different generation than ours is important. I can understand her feeling about Kamala Harris as part of the establishment. I think Priscilla is correct in the sense when she's saying that is Harris the right person? But I've always said people have a tendency to vote against somebody as much as they vote for. And I think that her popularity is that she isn't Trump. I've always said I'd vote for Mr. Potato Head first before I'd vote for Trump. I think that that's the idea of the entire country. And the more crazy things that come out about Kamala Harris, I don't think people are getting more confident in Harris. I think that the excitement is that it's somebody other than Trump, and it's just not another octogenarian white guy. So I think that that's one of the reasons that she is doing as well as she has. And I would agree with Scott in the sense that she got a pretty good bump in the beginning, a post-convention bump. Yes, normally it's seen. But then again, Democrats' selection of Kamala Harris is unlike anything that we've ever seen before. So it's very hard to take historical, well, this is what happens usually after the convention, and apply it here. Her rise, 6 or so weeks that she's been running, is phenomenal. Deference to Scott, it is. There was only so much that you could expect. Do I read anything into it? I would also agree, all of us have done statistical data at some point in time in our careers. What questions you're asking really create a confirmation bias by whoever is the one taking the poll. Throughout the history of Trump being involved in the political spectrum, polls have always underestimated him. That could be that somebody supports Trump and is unwilling to say so to a pollster. Absolutely possible. There's a lot of differences when it comes to polls as far as, do I put any faith in the trend? I put the faith in the fact that, yes, Harris is on the rise. I agree with Priscilla that people may be leery. Is Kamala Harris the right choice? But as Scott said, we tried to figure out who could possibly. And I think the closest we came, Gretchen Whitmer, I think she was the closest we came to a possibility. I mean, I had all sorts of maniacal ways that we were going to put people in the Supreme Court and move people here and move people there to make this politically workable. You're really seeing this is a referendum on Trump. And as long as it stays a referendum on Trump, Harris is in pretty good shape, because the more he talks, he shoots himself in the foot. And yeah, that may be the reality TV, shock TV that his ardent fan base likes. The rest of the country, I think, we're ready to not renew that season of that show. We're ready to move on to something completely different. Hopefully we will.
Now, talking about renewing the season of the show, the movie just released an independent film called The Apprentice, and it's a biopic. And there's actually a Kickstarter going on right now to try to raise funds to keep it in the theaters longer.
Really?
Really? They don't do that by just going and buying popcorn?
Right. I haven't checked the Kickstarter this morning, but there is a lot of interest in, I think, using media to communicate, and that's where I think also polls are becoming an outdated technology. If you really want to get a feel for where things are looking at, scroll through TikTok, scroll through Twitter, X, see what people are posting about. What I see. Now, granted, my algorithm knows this is what I want to see, but I see a lot of support for change. And however we get to the change, the end goal is as long as we do change. And I think that's where we also run into the Trump popularity, is there is a generational divide, and the younger folk who do support Trump are supporting him as a celebrity. They're not supporting him because of any attachment to the political issues. So I think that, okay, Mark, you made a face.
Well, I'm wondering, I mean, is this movie good for Trump or bad for Trump?
I have no idea.
Oh, I thought maybe they'd be saying that on X or Twitter or whatever it's called, or
I don't
TikTok.
think they've seen it. I don't think they've seen it yet.
Oh, okay. All right.
I believe it is derogatory of Trump. And I also wanted to add to your point, Priscilla. I believe it was on MSNBC. They were at a Trump rally, and Trump was saying to one of the people behind him or in front of him or something, "How many times have you been to the show?" Because this person has been to many, many rallies, and Trump was referring to his own rally as a show, which again speaks to his celebrity and the fact that even his rallies are shows. So he's a showman, and it's like he's not serious at all. So when you were saying, Priscilla, also I wanted to ask you about change and seeing Kamala Harris as establishment. What about Tim Walz? Do people see Tim Walz, former assistant coach, former school teacher, and so on, as being establishment?
The vibe that I've picked up is that not necessarily that they're seeing him as establishment, that there's a lot of support for him as a in this role as vice president because of the role modeling that he brings. So it's he's neither pegged right now, I think, as establishment or anti-establishment or non-establishment or whatever. But, the way that his family reacted during the convention, the way that, he has already established a reputation for being community oriented. I think right now people are seeing him as at least the person who's saying and doing the right thing, like the proverbial walking your walk and talking your talk and being authentic. And I think he is definitely going to help be a balance to Kamala. I know in the scheme of things, he's a relatively young guy who looks older. And so, visually, I think he's definitely going to help transcend some biases that might be projected onto Kamala, and that may help out. And then meanwhile, because of how he shows up as a father, that was one of the things also that was appealing to Obama, was how he showed up as a father and how he was committed and dedicated to the community. I think still resonates with how people contextualize their family values much more than what we've seen in other candidates.
So would your generation prefer him to be the top of the ticket?
Speaking only for me, so this is a Priscilla only, not indicative of the rest of the world. I don't know that the Democrats really have the right person, but if I had to pick a celebrity to be the top person, I would probably lean towards, someone in the caliber of like Pete Buttigieg, or, somebody who had that more of that celebrity oomph. But I think Walz is where he should be for having the greater influence.
So you mentioned Pete Buttigieg like that. Who else? Who else would be a change candidate?
Well, once upon a time, past Priscilla would have said folks like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, but they're really starting to show their age, aren't they?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think they can help that.
And I think that's kind of the big problem, is when you have folks on platforms like TikTok who are pointing out that we have boomer candidates, and then we have people moving into politics who are millennials, like AOC, for instance. Gen Xers aren't being properly represented. I think there's a piece in there that's worth noting, that because they exist, that there are the politicians who are the Gen Xers, but they aren't speaking the Gen X language as much because they're kowtowing to the boomers and to the millennials. And so I think that there is something to be said about that generational figure really, coming in. And that's where I think Pete does best. For other people, I think it's really going to have to play out that we got to get those younger people more vocal. Someone like AOC, she doesn't even have to have a name anymore. We know her by her initials, but she's a well-established figure in the House. What she does and what Pete does that I think is, and Obama did the same thing, that I think we haven't seen many other career politicians do, is they're getting out into the spaces where people are going to engage in non-political topics, and they're doing interviews. Both Pete and AOC, there's a podcast series I've been listening to recently. The series is 99% Invisible, and they're doing a read through of The Power Broker, which is a biography of Robert Moses and all he did to shape New York City. And both AOC and Pete came in and contributed an episode into that space. It's like, okay, now I've heard them talk about things that I wouldn't necessarily have heard on the national sphere, because now they're coming into a different space, an alternative space where they can reach people in a different way. And that's what we need to see more of among the party. And I don't think that I don't think we've been there to the extent that we were under Obama.
I certainly know what Pete Buttigieg thinks about Robert Moses. I probably should tune into the podcast to find out what AOC thinks about him. Imagine it's probably fairly similar. I mean, AOC is a perfect example of somebody who could use a little bit more seasoning, in my opinion. She's a remarkable talent, very, very smart, comes across great, beautiful, the whole package. But she has had a tendency to say things sometimes without thinking them through, and that has hurt her reputation. Also, I think that there's something about a certain level of chirpiness that disturbs some older people probably about her. That and Buttigieg's best stuff is his incredible ability and really remarkable political talent to go into the den of lions and just flip it around on them. So that he's the one doing the attacking and they're just sitting back awed by him.
Yeah, I think we once said that Pete Buttigieg, if Kamala Harris does get elected president, he should have something maybe like Secretary of State would be a great position, because let's remember, he was a mayor. He has proven himself a adept, as Scott says, adept political operative in the United States, and getting some chops behind him that shows international, that he has that ability to go internationally and make a change and make a difference on that international stage, which is a lot different than just trying to do it here at home. I think that would serve Mayor Pete very well. And I think we said this maybe about 2 weeks ago. Pete Buttigieg is really, a rising star because today we can all say his name. When he first came out, none of us could say Buttigieg. I mean, we were stumbling over it, but we today can now say Pete Buttigieg and say it perfectly fine, as if it just rolls off the tongue. And so, yeah, I really do. I think if he was to get a position like Secretary of State, where he was going to internationally, I think that probably Pete Buttigieg would be looking at, and I like saying the name now because I can actually say it. I mean, I think he would be a real contender, a true contender in, say, 2032. And he'd still be a very, very young man.
Jasmine Crockett? Any
Terrific.
thoughts on Jasmine Crockett?
Yeah,
Well,
love her.
Yeah, I love her. I love her too. But again, they're in the Congress, which is more focused on internal things. They're more focused on the United States. You've got to have that experience where you are dealing with international, because we are still the last remaining superpower and we have to deal with the rest of the world. And the rest of the world does not work the way just the United States does. You've got to deal with the Germans. You've got to deal with the Italians and the British and the French and the Russians and the Chinese. And I think that's an important thing for many of these young people. Yes, they're excellent when they get into those committee meetings and they, Crockett, who blasted Marjorie Space Laser Green. Yeah, fabulous. But can't get away with that when you're dealing with the Russians. Can't get away with that when you're dealing with the Chinese. AOC could not say what she says in the way she says it when she's on the international stage. You have to be, as Scott says, I don't know if it's more seasoned. You got to be more disciplined. You can be undisciplined in the Congress to a point. compared to when you're on the international stage, there's some discipline that you've got to have. Having worked with the Phoenix Group, I could tell you right now, when we talked to people of the United Nations, when we were doing research for them, the way we addressed, the people that we worked for or at the International Criminal Court was a lot different than, say, the four friends here talking would be. You had to be far more disciplined. And sometimes that wasn't the most easy thing to do, but you have to learn it.
Go ahead, Priscilla.
I was just say one last thing,
Please.
just to respond to what you're saying, Mark, is I think one thing that we as a country probably need to come to terms with is we probably should stop calling ourselves a superpower.
Well,
I know it's part of the soup. It's been baked into our textbooks, since the 40s and all of that fun stuff. But I think that the perception of America as a superpower has actually what's helped fuel a lot of the nationalism and the stage of the Conservative Party right now to open up this possibility that we are in fact a dominant world force and everyone should bow to us and everyone should listen to us, rather than removing the label and recognizing that we are a player on the global stage.
And you know what, Priscilla, I would totally agree, to the sense that we cannot shun the fact that we are not only a player in the world, but we're a major player. In fact, we are probably the most major player. We are a huge player. The problem that we run into is that it's just here domestically, there comes great responsibility. And it's just like when I talk to my students, yes, you have rights and you have freedoms, but with them come great responsibility. And if you're unwilling to accept the responsibilities of the rights and the freedoms that you were given, then that leads to chaos. I don't have a problem calling us a superpower, but we need to accept the responsibilities, and that's all responsibilities, as it comes to climate change, as it comes to all of the world's issues, food security. We have the ability to make a difference, and we have that responsibility. We cannot just be a country of me, us, I. We have to be a country of we're in this together, and we have a responsibility to the rest of the world. But I definitely understand your point to that.
May I just ask one thing, Priscilla, to your point, which I think is very interesting? I've heard the term hyperpower, but that was back in the 2000s. It's very interesting to me that on the one hand, Trump will say, oh, we're a failing country, we're a failing nation, we have to make America great again, blah, blah, blah. But at the same time, we're the last superpower. And how do you reconcile and align those two views?
I don't know that I would necessarily say that anyone is a superpower. I would even question the extent to which we can even say we're global influencers. I think that it's all a matter of how one looks at whatever thing they're saying is their primary driver, right? Is it a matter of who has access to the most resources, who has the most money, who has political clout, who has the most nuclear bombs? I think there's so many variables in those different categories. I don't think we can lump all of these things under a single label and describe it to any single country. I think everybody has a different part to play in our global narrative. If as Mark is saying, ours is the fact that we do have an abundance of resources that we could be doing better with. We wouldn't be, that would be our thing, right? Meanwhile, we would probably have far different conversations on the domestic front if we were doing better things with our resources, rather than, I don't even know what games people are playing in that me space, but then there are other countries who also have wealth of resources. So it depends on what's the priority, what's the thing that we want to define, our powers and categorize them by, or do we even need to at this point? And is it really, if we're going to move towards a genuinely integrated global world, we just have to get rid of the labels, get rid of the me's, get rid of the dictators, and start actually coexisting on this planet.
I kind of understand the point of the comment of superpower. We can lead. We can do a lot for the world if we lead. Maybe we got to come up with a new word. Maybe we'll come up with a new word. We came up with the term zombie ideas, which actually I saw stuck. Somebody actually wrote a paper that had zombie ideas, and I think we got credited for that, for those ideas that, are supposed to be dead and they just won't go away. So yeah, maybe we do need to come up with a different term to describe what a country with the amount of resources, the amount of ability to do good, what we should call that. So that's all the time we have for today's episode. The Nova Society is a production of the Phoenix Research Institute. We'd like to thank our sponsors for this episode. BH Conflict Resolution Services, a full-service dispute resolution firm offering expert and cost-effective mediation services to couples, groups, and businesses. BHCRS can be reached at www.bhcrs.com. We'd also like to thank our podcast partners, Buzzsprout, who hosts the Nova Society, Audacity, our editing partners, and Podkite, who does all of our analytics. iHeartRadio, where people get their music and podcasts, Apple iTunes, the largest source for music and podcasts on the internet, Spotify, the most popular source for the Nova Society. The Nova Society is available on all of these and other quality platforms. We'd like to thank all of our listeners. Without you, the Nova Society would not be possible. If you have a comment, question, or would like to be a guest on the Nova Society, we can be reached at nova.society.podcast@gmail.com. Always remember, the power of society is knowledge. So for Dr. Scott Gershwer, Dr. Priscilla Hobbs, Dr. Brooklyn Ann Weldon, and all of us here at the Nova Society, I'm Dr. Mark Bound. Be well, and we hope to see you again next time.